It's 2023, and you know what that means. It is time to do another tier list. I do one of these a year, and this will be my yearly one to start out 2023. Obviously, next year in January, we'll do one for 2024 because that's just the schedule I'm on. So, if you want to know my thoughts on every killer in DBD, you're in the right place. Hi, I'm DasFood, and today we're going to do the tier list, but before we get going, I want to lay down a few ground rules. We're going to get through these fast because I don't want to waste too much of your time. Ground rule number one is this is going to look pretty different from a lot of the popular tier lists. I have my own opinions, and while I respect and admire many DBD content creators, I just disagree about what they say about some of the killers. Ground rule number two that really needs to be understood is I don't think any killer is in the place of just being garbage tier, just terrible, super bad, don't play. I think that at worst, they maybe need some minor buffs. Some of them, I guess, maybe some reworks, whatever, but nothing is in that terrible tier where I just can't understand why anybody would play them. And then lastly, I am going off of the assumption that every killer here is being played with a mixture of perks and add-ons, and they're being played at least adequately. Not to the highest level imaginable necessarily, but I will factor in what high level play looks like. So I hope that clears up everything and we can get right into this because this will probably be a pretty long video. Let's get into it and start with the S tier. I think just for the sake of transparency, we're just going to throw the entire thing up on the screen right now so you can see the entire tier list. And obviously there will be timestamps if you want to jump to a specific killers section, but we're going to start in the S tier and start with the nurse, who you may have heard was recently hit with a nerf. Does that hurt her viability? Yes. But does that make her, you know, less than the best killer in the game? No, not at all. She is still absolutely nutty, even if she's not going to be able to basically break the game by getting value out of things like Starstruck or Save the Best for Last. She is still incredibly powerful for the simple reason that she ignores basic looping. And while I never want to talk down to you, if you're not entirely sure what I mean by that, when I say ignoring basic looping, what I mean is that most killers have to deal with pallets in one of two ways. They go around them or they break them. Now, I guess there are the projectile ones that can still get hits over them, but at the end of the day, they're still going to have to either go around that pallet or break it. In the case of the nurse, she doesn't have to do this. Walls and pallets are just no issue to her. She goes through them and doesn't have to regard them at all. While this seems like a pretty simple thing, it is an absolutely game-breaking mechanic. And I hear people talk about the counters to nurse, and if you watch my nurse gameplay in the background, you might say, well, she's not that good. Look at how much food is struggling. But I have always been super transparent about the fact that I am just a garbage tier nurse. And I think that any killer that can basically ignore the ways that survivors are supposed to be able to counter a killer is going to be in that discussion for the very strongest killer. Now, I will say she is hurt by Dead Hard more so than most killers. I wouldn't say she's hurt the most by it, but she's definitely hurt more so by Dead Hard. But that is such a minor thing. Such a minor thing when you consider the power and slugging capabilities of this killer. She will always be the strongest killer unless she's changed substantially. Her add-ons, I mean, they can be decent, I guess, but they're nothing special. But even so, she is still extremely strong. Has great synergy right now with a lot of popular perks, but that's going to change pretty dramatically soon. So at least we're going to see a new and possibly more interesting era of the nurse, but I think she's still going to be at the top of the mountain. Rounding out S tier, which I try to keep as kind of hallowed ground, so I don't want too many people in S tier, I'm going to put the Blight in there. Now, Blight is different from the nurse, but he's debatably just as lethal. So he does have to deal with pallets. However, he can shred them pretty quickly. So it's not a huge deal for Blight that he has to deal with pallets, but he is below nurse because he can't quite ignore them in the same way. But I think the big difference for me when I'm comparing Blight and nurse is I think Blight has a much higher skill ceiling. I think that a truly cracked Blight is more impressive than a truly cracked nurse. Which isn't to say that, you know, just a next level nurse isn't impressive. It's just to say that I think a crazy good Blight like that is more impressive, right? And I think that it's funny when people talk about how powerful nurse is, and this is anecdotal, I realize that, but I can recall far more times of getting rolled by a really good Blight than by a nurse. And I just think that Blight offers some counterplay, but not nearly as much as most killers. You are kind of in this position where you do have to pre-throw everything. He's got insane mobility. He's got some really good add-ons. He's got great synergy with some really good perks. There's really not much about Blight that you could complain about. He's also not very map dependent. This is a guy who's going to be just as scary on pretty much any map. So I think he earns his place in the S tier, but I think he's a much healthier S tier than Nurse because there is counterplay to the Blight. Moving on to the A tier, we get our first really, I think, controversial placement, and it's not having Spirit at the top of the A tier. I actually put the Executioner Pyramid Head at the top of the A tier, and I realize that there are going to be people who fervently disagree with this placement, and I'm okay with that. I just hope that they, hear me out on this. And one thing I have to make perfectly clear, I do not demonize certain playstyles, camping, tunneling, gin rushing, whatever. These are strategies and they are viable and they're not some kind of ban-worthy offense. You're allowed to play the game how you want to play the game. And in the case of the Executioner, he is the king of tunneling. And by the way, tunneling is the most effective strategy for winning. I know people hate to hear that. I know that people like to, there was kind of this rumor for a long time that tunneling was actually not very effective at all, and they're going to no, if you can make it a 3v1 pretty quickly, you're gonna win the game. So he is debatably the best at the game's strongest killer strategy. But why is the Executioner so good at tunneling? Well, it basically comes down to his ability to send survivors to Cages of Atonement and then also insta-kill them on the third one. This is a phenomenal ability that is going to counter a lot of the current survivor meta, whether it is Reassurance or something like Borrowed Time, which you don't see as much. You don't see as much Borrowed Time. Off the record, any of that. He can ignore all of that and still be insanely strong against the ways that survivors can make a killer's life much harder. He also has a pretty good counter to pallets in that through his M2 ability, he can actually just basically do this projectile that goes along the ground and will hit survivors through a pallet, through a wall, whatever. He can injure multiple survivors at once. He has great synergy with Save the Best for Last. You're not really going to see a lot of Executioners not running Save the Best for Last. This is a killer where the only real weakness I can think of is that he's kind of slow. And even then, he's a base movement speed killer. He's base movement speed, but he's not speedy, right? 115 may be good for a chase, but it's not good for getting around the maps. And as maps get larger and larger, that does hurt him to some extent. But this is the king of tunneling. He's great in the 1v1. He has synergy with good perks. Really, I would say his biggest downside is, man, his add-ons are trash. The only one that's really worth getting involved with is the ones that add length, distance to his M2 ability. Outside of that, he has some pretty bad add-ons, but outside of that, he's a fantastic killer. And if you're looking at trying to kind of step your game up and maybe not get bullied by the really good survivor teams, this is a fantastic killer to play. You just have to be okay with the fact that tunneling is kind of what he does best. And if you're one of those people who has some moral quandary against tunneling, then he's probably not for you. Next up, we have the Spirit, and I gotta be honest, it feels really weird not only not having her in the S tier, but not having her top 3. But that's not to say she's bad. This is still A tier. These are still killers that should expect to win more games than they lose, and to win plenty of them fairly easily. This is a crazy, crazy strong killer. So what does she do well? She is, in my opinion, the best 1v1 chaser not named the Nurse. This is a killer who, if you have a competent player controlling her, she will beat you in the 1v1 because you're going to have a lot of 50-50 opportunities. And for a while there, it wasn't looking great for her because she got all of the nerfs. But then they also nerfed Iron Will, which is the go-to Spirit counter. And now I think that really evened the playing field and made Spirit just a whole lot better. I think that the fact that survivors can't be silent around her when she's phasing anymore is pretty crazy good for her. And you could really argue that she should still be S tier, or at least top of A tier. I think she's a little weaker than Executioner, but I do think that one thing that works in her favor is she is way easier to use than any of the killers ahead of her. I think she is way easier than Executioner and Blight, and I think she's she's also easier than Nurse, even though I think Nurse is not as, you know, I think it's closer. But yeah, Spirit's a really good killer. Again, you go back to tunneling. She's great at tunneling. She's got good mobility. And what it comes down to more than anything is that crazy, insane, very good chase. Some decent add-ons. Some of them are kind of gimmicky, but overall, yeah, very, very good killer. Next, we move on to the Artist. And I had a hard time placing Artist because there's so much that she does well. I just didn't want to overrate her based off of anecdotal evidence, right? The evidence that I can't seem to beat an Artist. The fact that, you know, it's like, wow, well, maybe I've just had a bad run. But no, I don't know. I think that the Artist does quite a few things really, really well. I think she's the best tracking killer in the game. Yes, even better than Doctor. I think that this is, you know, Doctor is the best tracking killer within, like, what, a 36-meter radius. But if we're talking the entire map, the Artist has no jurisdiction, right? The Artist can find you wherever you are. She gets to know which gens you're working on, even without the help of perks, which can open up her perk slots for more meta perks. And obviously, she's another one that generally goes pretty well with the meta. She can defend a 3-gen pretty well. I'm not going to try to mention save the best for last for every single person, but because she is a killer with a pretty reliable M2 to do damage with, she can pair well with save the best for last, which I think right now is in the running for, like, it's debatably the best killer perk ever since they decreased the cooldown of basic attacks anyway. Right now, Artist is in a really good place. She can know where at least the majority of a team is at pretty much any point that she so desires. Really, her only big issue, and the only reason that I don't really, I consider putting her a little lower, is because maps like the game and Midwich and what the RPD, those are not her friend, because, you know, obviously she needs her crows to be reliable to get her information, and on multi-level maps she just can't do that. A lot of survivors currently complain about the hold W meta, and whether you love it or you hate it, Artist is kind of the face of that hold W meta because she can set up one of her dire crows and she can flush you out of an unwinnable loop. A loop that's unwinnable for her, I mean. She can flush you out of it and make you go to a weaker, riskier loop, which is an insanely strong power, and it's why I'm pretty comfortable having her where she is on the tier list, because right now the Artist is just crazy strong. Also pretty strong is the Plague. The Plague is where she is in this tier list because she counters the current meta really like nobody else. She gives survivors this choice, right? They can stay broken, or they can essentially give her superpowers, and those are the two options. And a Plague that knows how to resource manage, you know, if survivors are cleansing, you need to know, is it a good time to use the red spit or not? And by the way, most of the time it is a good time to use it, but the Plague keeps survivors injured. She keeps them noisy. There's even a visual indicator for where they are with all of the kind of green nastiness that's emanating off of them. You know where survivors are. So there's really no issue with tracking. If you're like me and you can't keep up with survivors to save your life, this is a fantastic killer. If you see medkits and you're playing Plague, you can just laugh knowing that they're about to waste an item. And even if they go to chest and they find a medkit, it's a waste. They might as well not even pick it up because it's not going to do anything for them against the Plague. Now, there is a pretty notable downside to Plague, and that's that she does have this dependence on survivor actions and RNG, which I think it's why she's where she is and not ahead of some of the other killers, because she can't really control whether survivors cleanse or not, and sometimes survivors can be kind of sneaky about it, so that's definitely notable. There's also the question of fountain spawns, because sometimes they just don't spawn in super convenient places, but I still think she's very strong all the same. And what kind of separates her from a lot of really high tier killers is that if you can get down the projectile, I guess the pathing of her puke, she is a really, really simple killer to play. And I think that there is something beautiful about that when you have a killer that leaves the door open for some big brain plays, but is also pretty baseline simple. Moving on, we have the Mastermind, Albert Wesker, who is another one who I would describe as having a simple but powerful ability. So his little lunge attack where he uses Ouroboros to, He goes forward once, and then he goes forward a second time, and on the second one he goes much further. That is a really neat ability, and it's really, really good. I do think it's currently hurt by some of the janky hitboxes in the game, where you'll be going and seemingly nothing at all catches you, but I think it's pretty rare. I think that for the most part, he's able to work around that, and it's not a big enough deal that I'm going to knock him down a few pegs for it. I also think that his biggest advantage also has to do with Ouroboros, and that is slowing survivors down. So if they get to the, they call it critically infected. Once they become critically infected, they suffer an 8% movement penalty, or they go and they find a chest and they open it and they cleanse, yada yada, but hey, they're not on a gen at that point. That's slowdown, that's built-in slowdown. So if you can use your ability and you can get them critically infected, they move 8% slower. For those of you who don't know the math of how it works, all survivors move at what they call 100% movement speed. This is the base movement speed. Wesker moves at 115% movement speed, which, if we do some simple math, and I am an English major, so forgive me for, not being great at math, but you think about an 8% deduction from the 100%, you think about Wesker already moving at a baseline 15% faster, all of a sudden, you, Wesker, the killer, you are moving 23% faster than critically injured survivors. That is insane. You are going to win every chase where you are moving 23% faster. I mean, it's almost like built-in play with your food at that point, which is really, really strong. Wesker is a wonderfully designed killer, and he is really, really impressive. Very, very strong in the 1v1. Next, we have Huntress. Huntress has been around forever. If you're new to the game, I apologize because this is going to be a pretty brief one. Again, you talk about a simple power. You have hatchets, you throw the hatchets. They do instant damage if they hit. Very, very simple, very straightforward. She does have one of the highest skill ceilings in the game. The difference between a good Huntress, a great Huntress, an elite Huntress, and a 1%er Huntress is very notable. Huntress can feel so oppressive if you're going up against the best of the best. When played right, she can absolutely mow down even skilled survivors relatively quickly. However, she does have some built-in downsides to try to cap her potential a little bit. The big one being that she has to reload very frequently. So, I mean, if we're assuming this is base Huntress, she starts with 4 or 5 hatchets, she's going to be reloading a lot because a good Huntress is going to basically make almost every attack a hatchet attack instead of an M1. So you're going to have to reload pretty quickly. Hopefully you can do that after you've downed a survivor and you're hooking them. Next, we have another debatably controversial placement. I put Nemesis in the A tier, and there are a few reasons for this. I understand why some would put him B tier, but I think that Nemesis is the best pallet shredder in the game. So for a game where people are very quick to throw down every pallet because every map seemingly spawns with 500 million pallets these days, Nemesis is so good at getting rid of destructible walls and breakable pallets. He is crazy good at applying that pressure. He's also got some of the best synergy in the game with Save the Best for Last, which again, I promise I'm not going to mention it for every killer, but it's a fantastically strong perk, and on Nemesis, it's even stronger. The zombies are inconsistent, but occasionally they are clutch. And it's not just about bad survivors. There are times you're able to kind of zone a survivor into a zombie, and they have to choose between getting punched by you or slapped by a zombie. And those, it's a lose-lose situation. He's menacing in the 1v1. You really don't escape a good Nemesis. He's going to down you, especially if he's got his tentacle at tier 2 or higher. This is a killer that is pretty terrifying. Really, the only reason I don't have him higher is because a quick start is not just important, but I would say essential for for any given match, right? If you don't get the tentacle at least to tier 2 within the first, 45 seconds of the game, maybe minute of the game, you are probably looking at a loss. You have got to get that tentacle up early. Because he's pretty weak until he gets that done. So that's the only reason, but as far as killers whose power scales as the game goes on, he's debatably the best one. Next up, we have the Knight, and I cannot for the life of me understand why people are being so harsh on old Tarhosh here. He is an insanely strong killer. I'm not sure where people are getting this idea that he's weak, but look, you can either look at this from the optimistic or pessimistic point of view. The optimist would say that he's the clown on steroids, while the pessimist would say he is artist on a diet. He is a fantastic zoner. I would use the term reactive zoning. So you have some like Hag and Trapper who are proactive zoners. They put their traps ahead of time and then they try to get people towards the traps. Whereas some of the zoners in the game, in the vein of, you know, artist, clown, knight, who have all been mentioned, they are reactive zoners. They go to the survivors and then they start zoning. And I think that he is directly in the middle between those two. He's not quite as good as the artist because he just doesn't have the same tracking ability, and knowing where survivors are is obviously hugely important. However, he's clearly stronger than the clown. Great synergy with the guards can give the knight the ability to essentially insta-down, which is a crazy powerful thing when you think about it. If you wait until the last second to M1 a survivor, they get hit by the Carnifex or the assassin or the jailer, whatever. They get hit and then you M1 them before they can get the speed boost from it, you can insta-down them. This is a killer with insta-down built in, and while it's not the most reliable method, that's still pretty strong. The biggest issue with the knight that I've had so far is just the jankiness of his power. Sometimes it lets survivors make distance. You know, you go to place a guard down and the game's just like, oh, you want to place a guard? Yeah, bet you do. And they just don't let you do it. Very frustrating. Sometimes the guards also don't seem to detect survivors when they should. But outside of that, this is a very strong killer. And I may be overrating him, I may be underrating him, but my initial read here is that this is a very, very powerful killer. Moving on to the B tier, we have the killer that I definitely rate lower than a lot of people, and that's the Oni. And I may be missing something here. I must be missing something here because everyone else seems to think that Oni is borderline S tier. And while there was a point in time, I think if you go back and watch my older ones, my older videos, you'll see that I was kind of that opinion. Nowadays, I just don't see it. Now I look at it and I see a killer with a very, very weak early game, and he has to eat pretty much every pallet on the map, which is never a good thing. And he's just not built for the era of medkits and Will Make It and Circle of Healing and Unbreakable and Exponential, etc, etc. This is a killer who right now is kind of abused by the meta. However, all of that said, I have him at the top of B tier for a reason. When played well, his Demon Dash is great for slugging. This is a killer who can get an entire team down if played well, and if you know all the flicks and whatnot. This is a pretty crazy powerful killer in his own right. It's just that right now I think the meta is doing everything it can to make Oni not useful, which is kind of unfortunate because he's such a cool character. Next up, we have the Dredge, and when it comes to Dredge, I had a hard time placing him, probably harder than any other killer, just because the optimistic part of me wants to put him higher, and then the pessimistic part of me wants to put him lower, so I kind of split the difference here. I think that Remnant, where he leaves behind the little shadow self that he can teleport back to, when it's played right, this guarantees a hit that most killers just simply couldn't get outside of the projectile killers, which is good. It's good to have a killer who can use teleportation in a way that gets him hits, as opposed to most killers like Freddy and Sadako who teleport for mobility exclusively. He can teleport for chase reasons and for mobility reasons. So pretty good there. Some really fun add-ons, some really good ones as well. And he's a great tracker during Nightfall. This is a killer that just by teleporting around during Nightfall, he can kind of get a lay of the land and figure out where everyone is. The biggest issue is obviously the ability from survivors to lock the lockers. I will always hold that a killer who has to deal with something they can't necessarily account for is going to get docked a few points for it. The extra time required to break out of a locked locker isn't anything insane, but it does add up. And I think where you really lose time with it is not from, okay, well, I lost, an extra second, an extra 2 seconds here getting out of the locker. It's that it lets a survivor know you're there and they can get to a pallet, which costs you what might have been an easy hit. So I think that's the big one for Dredge. That's the big downside. But outside of that, he's good in the chase. He's good with mobility. Has decent add-ons. Good synergy with good perks. Not a whole lot to dislike about this killer. I think he earns his place in the B tier. Next, we have the Cenobite. And when it comes to the Cenobite, I kind of think about, so if you've ever played Mortal Kombat, you know that at least in the games when I used to play them, the whole thing was juggling, right? Never letting your opponent hit the ground so they can't really counter or anything like that. And I think that the Cenobite's kind of a juggling type killer, where his whole thing is never letting the Lament configuration get too far from him, never letting it get out of his sight, right? Because if he can keep that pressure up, if he can keep downing the survivor that picks up the Lament configuration, all of a sudden, it's a gimme. It's a very, very easy win at that point. However, the big issue, and I think this is a very big issue, is that the game, as we've gone on, has added larger and larger maps. And on these larger maps, Pinhead does very poorly because he can be on the same half of the map as the Lament configuration when it starts getting solved, and he still can't get there in time to disrupt the solving process, unless he wants to teleport to it, but that defeats the purpose, right? So I think that's his biggest issue. His biggest issue right now is that the map size is doing him no favors. Outside of that, he's really good in the 1v1. He has a very high skill ceiling. There is a lot to like about this killer. I had predicted that 2022 would be the year where they start shrinking maps a little bit, but they actually did the opposite. They're just getting bigger and bigger, and killers like Pinhead are really suffering for it. Next, we move on to the Hag, a killer who I think has just consistently gotten weaker despite her kit not really being changed. I think that things like the ever-growing maps and the ever-changing meta are really not here to help her. But I would say she's debatably the greatest victim of the ever-enlarging maps, even though her thing was always just picking out a specific corner anyway. The biggest knock I can give Hag is that she was the former queen of camping, but now that base kit BT is a thing, she just can't do that as effectively. And again, we're not here to judge strategies for any kind of perceived, rule books. We're here to do viability. And in the case of the Hag, the viability of camping has gone way down, which I think that means her viability has gone way down. Now, if played well and patiently, she can still roll even good teams like few others. There's just a lot that needs to go right for that to happen, and a lot of that is out of her control. So for example, does she have time to set up her little danger zone, or does the survivor know ahead of time? Does she run into a survivor that starts saying, hey, it's a Hag, I'm going to harass her so she can't set up her web? And because I think that's the big thing. But if she gets it set up and it's a good person who's a good player, that is, who's ready and willing to do what needs to be done, this can still be a really good killer. Moving on, we have the Hillbilly, and it's funny because I mentioned that it felt weird not having the spirit in the top 3. Well, there was a time where Hillbilly was always in the top 3, and in fact, a time where he was always in the top 2. So the fact that he's down here is kind of sad, but I actually would say I'm ranking him a lot more highly than most people seem to, because I do think he's actually underrated at this point. He has a tremendous mobility, right? His mobility is really off the charts, and he's got an insta-down power that I always hear people talk about. Oh, well, it's just too hard to get insta-downs with Billy, but I've seen plenty of Hillbillies who are more than capable of doing it. Top tier Billies are very, very good, and I know that I said I wasn't judging these killers off what the top tier can do, but I said I was going to go off of playing them competently, playing them well, and if you're playing Billy well, you're at least getting some chainsaws. So this is a killer who's got a lot going for him, and he's not nearly as hurt by large maps. What he's hurt by is indoor maps. He is not nearly as good on the indoor maps, and obviously, much like quite a few killers, he's really affected by the janky hitboxes, which is something I really hope TBD figures out in the coming year, because nothing's more frustrating than basically having a hit, or you would have been able to go break up a gen that's being worked on or something like that, but then an invisible box keeps you from it. So Hillbilly and Baba are both hurt by that, because chainsaw killers are pretty reliant on getting maximum value out of their chainsaw. But overall, good killer, great mobility, great lethality. His only real issue is a super high skill ceiling, and the fact that right now the game's just a little too janky for what he would like to do. Next, the Demogorgon, the very picture of balance. This killer is above average in almost every way. Above average lethality, mobility, tracking, slowdown, but it's not oppressive in any of those regards. Nobody should ever say, well, it's not fair, we didn't have a shot, it was a Demogorgon. The Demogorgon is a really, really well-balanced killer that does just about everything well, but doesn't do anything so well that you can start to kind of scoff and say, well, of course you won. Now, I will say that while every killer is hurt by Dead Hard, I think that Demo is especially hurt by it, because you can tell when the Demo's getting ready to do the shred attack, and I mean, at that point, you can just use, what do we call it, Dead Crutch, Crutch Hard, whatever it is. It's still a garbage perk for garbage players, but love you if you use it, but you gotta realize it's just such a BS perk, but it's so bad for the game, and it's bad for killers like Demo, who would get a deserved hit, but you pressed E, so you survived. You know, that's kind of BS, but outside of that, the Demogorgon's got a lot going for it. I especially love that one add-on it has, which, by the way, some of its add-ons are actually of the brown rarity. Some of its best add-ons, you know, things like getting faster cooldown time on missed shreds, which I guess some people say that's not good because you're supposed to be hitting your shreds, but I use it all the time. Getting extra teleport portals, that's the big difference between a good Demogorgon and a bad Demogorgon. Good Demogorgons know how to use their portals, bad demos don't. And then obviously there's the one add-on where when traveling through a portal, the Demogorgon can see where literally everyone on the map is. That is insanely good. That's a very powerful add-on. So overall, really, really good killer, and I hate that it was taken out of the game because more people deserve the chance to play as and against this killer. Now we have the Deathslinger. Deathslinger is slow, he's map dependent, he's highly susceptible to gen rushing, but he's also a beast in the 1v1 and impossible to get away from. I think this may be, outside of like Nurse, this may be the scariest killer to just straight up 1v1. Deathslinger in the right hands is just impossible to get away from, and to me, that's why I can't put him any lower than this in spite of all the really obvious downsides. And again, there are a lot of downsides, especially ever since they nerfed his stealth. If you don't know, he used to have a smaller terror radius, and with something like Monitor and Abuse, you could actually get within the distance of shooting a survivor, just barely, where you could get the shot off before they heard your terror radius, which was so cool, so good. I really hope they bring that back at some point, because I don't think it was busted. I think it was something that was nice for such a slow killer. But overall, yeah, the increasing map size, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse. In fact, if I could beat 2 dead horses here, negative for Slinger is that the increasing map sizes really bad for him. However, save the best for last, my other favorite dead horse here, is really good on him. You are not really going to find a Deathslinger, I don't think, that's running save the best for last. It is absolutely essential in so many ways. Really, really good though. And if you haven't played Deathslinger, give him a try. Call of Duty Man is pretty fun. Moving on, we get the twins. I think this is another killer like Oni that I find gets a little bit overrated. And that's not to say that they're not good. They're definitely strong. I just don't think that Victor is around enough for the twins to be A tier. And this is another one I've changed my opinion on over time. I find that the twins are very, very good. I find they're very powerful. However, if I've already docked a few killers for the fact that survivors can kind of impact how that killer has to play outside of the normal ways. I know that technically speaking, every killer has to deal with how survivors impact the game, because if not, you're playing NPCs. I get that. However, in the case of the twins, the fact that they can literally just hijack your power and leave you as an M1 killer, that is some BS. That is pretty frustrating, and it makes sense why they're reworking the twins. I hope they keep the general idea of chasing around with Victor, but change something here, because that's pretty bad. But I mean, granted, Victor can, if everybody stays injured, Victor becomes an S tier power. However, gosh, that's my third dead horse. We're in the healing meta, right? You have Circle of Healing, you will make it. You have health kits, you have med kits every single game, which really hurts the twins. Overall, the twins are a killer that could be a lot better, but the game around them is just not really allowing for that. Next, we have the Cannibal, and I would describe him as being a stronger clown, which I realize I also said the same thing about the Knight, but this one's kind of different because I think Cannibal's a stronger clown in that he is electric in the chase, but he also has to deal nonstop with pre-throwing pallets, right? So I think that certain killers can kind of play around pallets some. Survivors are more comfortable playing around pallets with some, but if you're coming at them with a chainsaw, which is going to insta-down them, they're going to pre-throw the pallet. And, you know, the really good survivors will generally wait long enough, pre-throw it at the last second so they get the stun on you. And, you know, if they can stun you and you don't get to shred through the pallet, that is pretty frustrating as Cannibal. But you can't bother respecting the pallet because, you know, damned if you do, damned if you don't, yada yada. Now, with the arrival of Reassurance and the fact that it can actually be worked from a level above, so let's say, oh, I don't know, the basement, Bubba's camping abilities are more useless than ever. They were never a fantastic strategy, but I have seen a lot of teams fall to something like this. So if you have survivors who have 1 or 2 reassurances, a team with comms is going to be able to pop all 5 gens while you try to camp 1 survivor. So obviously Bubba is less viable than he's been in a long time, but he's still really, really good in the 1v1. So I think he belongs at the tail end of B tier here. He's still pretty scary, but there's a lot of work that could be done. Also, not gonna, you know, harp on it too much again, but the really random hitboxes going around things like bushes and all are really bad for Bubba. And they've gotten so bad that he went from being kind of my secondary main to somebody that I rarely play because it's just very frustrating. Now, let's move on to C tier and talk about a killer that when I was making this, I put him in a few different positions and I kept kind of reasoning, oh, well, maybe he should be at this place because of this place because of that, blah, 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 blah. It's Ghostface. Ghostface is easily the best true stealth killer in the game. And when I say true stealth, I mean, I'm not taking into account, you know, somebody like Demogorgon, that when it comes out of a portal, it's undetectable. I'm talking true stealth, where stealth is the essence of their kit. It is so easy for Ghostface to get survivors marked these days. And that is a good thing because this killer's potential is it's entirely dependent on his ability to mark survivors. If he can mark survivors, if he can be patient with it and keep 3 of them so close, just a millimeter away from being marked and then go after a different one, this is a killer who generally I think has to make comebacks. Generally, I think Ghostface is going to have 4 gens popped before he starts rolling. However, it's a killer who's very capable of that. If you can use the lean feature, which is a lot less buggy than it used to be, Ghostface becomes very scary very fast. One good thing for Ghostface is that some of his best add-ons are of the common rarity, meaning that he can use them every game and that every Ghostface you're going to see is going to be using those or something better. So pretty good there. His ability to insta-down also pretty consistently counters the healing meta, which is good because right now healing is just obviously kind of busted. Actually, if you're Ghostface and you hear like a boon pop up and you know it's Circle of Healing, that's good for you because you know you can go there and you can find potentially vulnerable survivors who, because you don't have a terror radius, they're not going to know you're there, right? So really, really good there. He will struggle against more coordinated teams, especially those using like Discord for voice comms or something like that. But yeah, I mean, you could argue that about every killer, I guess. Maybe especially so Ghostface, but I do think it applies to everybody. Next up, we have the Doctor, who is interesting because Doctor will always dominate mid to low tier survivors, but he's much less effective against good teams. Which is kind of the interesting dichotomy of this character, is that if you as a survivor aren't very good, the Doctor may make for a really long experience for you. However, if you are pretty good, you're probably not going to be pushed to the brink by any Doctors anytime soon. Now, Electric Shock is genuinely good when used correctly, but the downside is that it's kind of tough to tell when to use it correctly. I've seen a lot of Doctors who use it and they cost themselves in the chase more than they ever would have gained in the chase just by straight up M1ing it, just by holding W and pressing M1 when it applies. That being said, the ability to deny a vault or the ability to deny a hook save, anything like that, that is genuinely really good. And I do think that sometimes I see the Doctor trending kind of close to D tier. I don't think he's close to D tier. I think he's clearly above that. And I think you could even make the case of him being at the top of C tier. This is a good but not great killer, right? Also, I do like that he has fun synergy with perks like what, Merciless Storm, or I think it's not, is it Agitation, the one where, you know, the tear radius gets larger? He has fun synergy with kind of rarely used perks, which I think that's a real value, because that means he gets value out of the ones that everybody gets value out of, but then also some of them that maybe they don't. So pretty cool there. Overall, I would say he's a very fun killer, but maybe not a very strong one. All right, now we have the Trickster. And look, it's an overused comparison, so I'll get out of the way quickly. But yeah, Trickster is generally similar to Huntress, but just worse in pretty much every way. Now, I'm not going to say that he's worse in every way. I think that there are some benefits to Trickster. One of those being that he's much better at medium height loops than the Huntress. He can just kind of chip away at health states, whereas Huntress is much more reliant on getting that hit or suffering for it. Outside of that, though, maybe he's not so great. He's a good camper. He's definitely a good camper, especially if he goes after the unhooker instead of the one that just got unhooked. Main event is a pretty bad power, though, and when the stars align and main event comes in handy, it's really great. It's really awesome. In the other 99 games, you're going to find that maybe you don't get much value out of main event outside of getting like a single down at some point in the game, which it's fine, I guess. It's fine. It's one of those that, like, it's better than it used to be, so we all know it could be worse, but it's not great. Now we arrive at my favorite killer, the Clown. I'm sure by this point you know I'm a Clown main. So it's kind of funny because you talk about damned if you do, damned if you don't. If I put him higher, they would have said, well, he's a Clown main, he's biased. If I put him lower, it's like, oh, he's trying to make excuses for when he loses. So I'm just going to give you my honest take on the Clown here, and, you know, you can figure out how you feel about it. So, few killers are as gifted at ruining safe loops faster than the Clown, especially if it's a bamboozle Clown. It does come at a cost, though. And that is that experienced survivors know that there is one really effective method of dealing with the Clown, and there's not much Clown can do about it. That method is just pre-throwing pallets. If it is a god pallet, you know, they can play around it a little more. But even then, they're gonna have to pre-throw it. So you see where it's a case of pros and cons. The pros, you get rid of god pallets. The cons, a map like the Gideon Meat Plant has like 6 god pallets. So they can just take you from safe loop to safe loop, and they can make your life really, really hard. So if you assume that they're throwing all these pallets while their teammates are just slamming generators, the Clown can fall behind. He can fall behind pretty quickly, just on account of getting his daily dose of fiber and eating all of the pallets. Now, Clowns who utilize their yellow bottles can actually be far more dangerous, especially if used in unison with the purple bottles. You think about slowing a survivor down by, I think, 15%, and then speeding yourself up. All of a sudden, you talk about a winnable chase. They're moving at like 85% movement speed while you're moving at what, like 125, something like that. Very, very crazy difference there. So the Clown, I think is, I don't know. I feel like he's so much better after the recent universal killer buffs, where, you know, things like vault speed, pallet breaking, gen kicking, weapon cooldown, all of that, they made every killer better, obviously. But for somebody like Clown, who consistently has to do all of those things, the Clown got a lot better from all of that. And overall, I think he's in a good place. You could make the case that he's at the top of C tier. I don't know that I would necessarily do that. I don't want to be seen as too biased for my guy. But overall, people ask me a lot, hey, Clown's pretty bad, right? What should we do to buff him? And really, there's not much that they should do. I think that as things currently stand, the Clown is in a pretty good place. I mean, if he got a buff, I'd say maybe let him start with like 1 extra bottle or something. But outside of that, pretty good killer. Not much that needs to be changed. And if you're new to the game, Clown is actually a really good killer to pick up and start playing as. Forget the 280-page document about how to play Clown. That thing's ridiculous. Clown is very, very straightforward, and he's a pretty good killer. Next, we have the Legion. Legion does a great job of keeping teams injured, but hey, what have I said 1,000 times this video? What's the current survivor meta? What is it? Huh? What is it again? Oh, that's right. They can heal ridiculously fast. And the downside of Legion is teams know that if they don't heal, he essentially has no power, right? Because all they're going to have to do at that point is mend really quickly whenever he hits them. Bada bing, bada boom, nothing changed. Congratulations, you wasted like, what's it take, like 7 seconds to heal? Like, it's nothing crazy, right? It's nothing crazy. They can just hop back on whatever Jin they're doing. And that's before we talk about the other thing that I'm just beating into the ground at this point, the overly large maps. So Legion can try to go around and get that insta down for hitting the 4th person in Frenzy. But more realistically, that's not going to happen. More realistically, you're going to get 2 or 3, and the 4th one is going to Lithe or Sprint Burst far, far away, and you're never going to get that chance to touch them. So it is kind of unfortunate, right? It is kind of unfortunate. However, Legion has been much worse in the past, and the current version of Legion we have is better, definitely better, but I just don't feel like there's a lot going for Legion right now, because it feels at times like they're just an M1 killer who can occasionally run kind of fast, which is not ideal, right? It's not ideal, but that's not to say Legion's bad. Again, I don't think any killer's in a truly terrible state, and if played correctly, you know, I've watched Tataru play a lot of Legion, and honestly, watching him play, yeah, okay, there are some Legions who can definitely dominate. So, you know, I don't know. When it comes to Legion, I don't know that the rework was enough to make them super viable, but yeah, they're better than they used to be. Next, we have Amanda Young, the Pig. Prior to the rework to Pig's boxes, she would have been D tier. Now that a Pig player can more consistently exert pressure within their traps, though, I think she's a lot better, if still not great. Her stealth is generally laughable, and her dash attack is, I mean, it's not great, right? It's all right, and in the right hands, it's good, even. But as far as, you know, the kind of like M2 powers and all that go, it's nothing incredible. The Tampered Timer, however, is incredible. And if you're playing Pig and you're not running Tampered Timer as an add-on, you know, that, I'm just not sure what to tell you. That's how you get head pops. And on smaller maps, Pig becomes a lot scarier, especially if she's willing to be a little mean-spirited and kind of monitor the boxes and keep up with where people are. Pig can become a lot scarier then. However, all of that being said, I do think that Pig is where we're starting to get towards the kind of lower end of killers. Potentially very good in the right hands, but definitely needs a lot of things to break in her favor to be, you know, viable. Next, we have the Shape, and I think that it's funny to me when people talk about Michael Myers, when they talk about the Shape, they generally talk about how weak he is, and while they're talking about how weak he is, they'll usually have footage of them playing Michael in the background. And that footage will have them using a tombstone piece and insta-killing a survivor. Now for me, I'm a simple guy. But if you can insta-kill survivors, that's pretty good. Especially when it's as easy as it is for Michael. Because it's not hard to get those insta-kills. Michael is very capable. Now, a lot of the criticisms that have applied to a lot of the killers that have come before him do apply. A lot of pre-throwing. Once he's in tier 3, he's going to have to deal with the god loops and the, you know, the god windows and all of that. Of course, he's going to play from behind more often than not because his power is a charge up, and charge up killers as well as trap setting killers generally are playing from behind. I get that. I mean, I think most killers are kind of playing from behind more often than not, but especially in the case of Michael. So I do see the downsides, and I do think that some minor reworks to his kit, like getting to choose when he levels up, I think those would be huge for him. But as things currently stand, this is a killer who can play around with several add-ons and become much scarier, and he has good synergy with popular perks. So I don't think he's as bad as people make him out to be. I definitely don't think he's the worst killer in the game, which I've seen a lot of people saying. But I also don't want to, you know, kind of slingshot to the other side and say he's actually A tier. No, he's low C tier to me. He's low C tier, but he can be genuinely scary. Next, we have the Nightmare, Freddy, and I know I always roast Freddy, but here we're going to keep it professional, and we're just going to talk about Freddy from a viability standpoint. So when it comes to Freddy, I think that it's another example of a killer where we can say, you know, oh, he does the same thing as Killer X, but worse. And in Freddy's case, he's a reactive zoner like the artist, the knight, or the clown, but he's definitely worse than all of them. He teleports like the Demogorgon, Dredge, and Onryo, but he does so far less reliably, and it's actually an ability that's taken away from him completely once the final gen is popped. The Dream World is inconsistent and not all that impressive, so it's not like the status effects of, Wesker or Plague. Overall, he does a lot of things that you could say, oh, well, that's kind of like this other killer, but he does them slightly too dramatically worse. Despite his shortcomings, Freddy does have enough versatility that he can actually be pretty good in the right hands, because even if he's not great at all of those things, he can still do all of those things. And maybe the sum is greater than the, what is it? The sum is greater than the parts. That's the expression. I know English. So, as we've seen in the past, he is always a minor buff away from being a much scarier killer. So, I think that old Scary Terry here, old Sharp-Hand Joe, he does a lot of things poorly, and it's possible that they actually add up to being a kinda decent killer. Finally, we get to the Wraith, and much like Freddy, Wraith does several things, but doesn't do any of them especially well. So, he's a decent enough stealth killer with decent enough mobility and a decent enough skill ceiling. And that leaves him, to me, as a killer who I would describe with just that word. Decent. He is a decent killer. He feels kind of underwhelming, especially if you have been playing Executioner or somebody and then you go to Wraith. But he does have pretty versatile add-ons that can change his playstyle dramatically. And overall, I think that Wraith is one of those where you just never really know what you're going to get when you face a Wraith player. And while I wish he was a little better than he is, I don't want it to seem like him being at the bottom of C tier means that I think he's garbage. Everybody in C tier, to me, is still actually a pretty good killer. They just have very real and very notable downsides. Moving to the D tier, we have Sadako and Trapper. Now, I do want to clarify that when I talk about kind of what the different tiers mean, to me, D tier is the area where I start saying, okay, these killers have some crippling flaws and they need to be addressed at some point. Now, does that mean that either of these killers are garbage? I want to go back to that. No, I want to keep hammering this home. I don't think any killer in the game is garbage. I think that even Trapper, who I've put at the very bottom, has some very real upside. However, we're going to talk about Sadako first because she comes first on the tier list. So, Sadako, I appreciate the efforts from some content creators to get the most out of this killer, especially Coconuts RTS. He's done a lot to try to kind of boost the cult of Sadako. However, Sadako is just not as good as her counterparts. Yes, niche builds can make her spooky, but overall, she's a killer with high mobility and not much else. It's nice that she can teleport around the map. It's nice that she gets the little speed boost when she comes out of the television. It's nice that she can insta-kill, but man, I don't know. Her insta-kill takes so much more work than Myers. So I realize there are going to be people who say, if I don't address it now, they're going to say, well, you said all this about Michael, about how great it is that he can insta-kill, but then you put Sadako so low despite her being able to insta-kill. Her insta-kills, to me, are way harder to proc than Michael or Executioner's. And I think that's important, because even when I play around her and I try to go for, I try to get the condemned status effect. If you're not using add-ons, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Unless the survivors are just maybe not in the know and they go around just picking up tapes like they're starting a collection. But outside of that, she's pretty underwhelming. I just think that overall, this is a killer who can get around the map very well, but can't do much when she gets there. That being said, I do think she's fun, and I hope that nobody sees that she's in the D tier and says, oh, well, I guess I shouldn't play Sadako. You should. I actually think she's a lot of fun. She's fun to face. She's fun to play as. Overall, she's just not super strong. Lastly, we get to Trapper, and this poor boy. This poor boy is always at the bottom of my tier list, and it's just because I feel bad about it, but I can't put Trapper any higher. I can't. I cannot put any killer higher that loses 2 to 3 gens before getting a single chase going and says, yep, it's all going according to plan. That is a tough sell. That is a tough sell for a killer. Ultimately, the bear traps just aren't nearly as strong as the other abilities that you might call kind of build up abilities, where you start the early game weak and you're trying to get them where, you know, where all of a sudden the hunter becomes the hunted, right? It's not like Demon Dash or Nightfall or even other traps like the Hags. It's just, they're just not comparable. This is a killer who, yes, if he sets up his traps really ideally, and by that I mean he puts them in random places where survivors will never expect a trap, yeah, okay, he can reap some benefits. However, overall, yeah, I don't know. If any killer in the game is going to get a rework, I think Trapper makes a great case for it. That being said, man, it's satisfying to play Trapper. When you set up a trap and you kind of guide survivors into your web, it is really, really fun, and it's really, really rewarding. So give Trapper a try. You know, let's boost the amount of Trapper mains in the world, because this guy deserves better. But that's gonna do it for me. I hope you enjoyed this little 15-minute video that I did here. I know I said I was gonna try to stop doing the really long ones, but you can't really talk about 30 killers and have it go too short. As always, my links to my Twitch and my Twitter are in the description, so please do make sure you check those out if you want a little more Das food in your lives. Thank you so much for watching this one. I hope you're having a lovely day wherever you are. Hope 2023 is off to a great start to you. And hey, if you disagree with anything I said in this video, please let me know respectfully down below, and I am always happy to respond and have a little bit of a dialogue with people in the comments. So, all of that being said, I've been Das Food, and until next time, bye.
I've been dreaming on in my head like I've seen it. A life worth living is a life with meaning. I'll do what I love till my heart stops beating. I'm feeding this demon. Got a taste, can't erase bitterness in my